send it over to you.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate the introduction. So just a couple things before I jump in here. I would say this is all informational. The things that we're all learning are constantly evolving and changing. So please just consider this information, and anything that you might take away that you're interested in, please discuss that with your doctor. Not intending to provide any medical advice. So with that, I'm going to talk just a little bit first about how I got into all of this. And now this is really my full-time focus, but it was from, like many of us, my own health journey. I had a tick bite in 1996 in Northern California. I was fine for several months, and then over the course of a weekend, just had the worst flu, symptoms that I had never experienced to that intensity. Probably the most significant was head to toe burning sensations. Felt like a sunburn 24/7. That continued for a long time. Had issues with balance. Just getting up and walking across the room was using up most of my energy for the day. Sitting up in a chair was difficult because I constantly felt like I was leaning to the side. I would prop myself up with pillows in bed at night because I felt like I was rolling off onto the floor. Lots of gut issues, cognitive issues, many other neurological symptoms, numbness, tingling, crawling sensations, those types of things, fasciculations, tremors, internal vibrations, sensitivity to light and sound. And then whether or not this was because of what we would eventually identify as Lyme disease and mold illness and all of those things that we all know all too well, anxiety, depression, OCD, all of those things became significant. Could have been also just the fear of not really knowing what was going on. Back then, there were very few resources, very limited information. I really didn't stumble on the Lyme piece until 8 years later. So from the tick exposure until I finally got to someone that knew what they were talking about, and that was kind of just a little bit accidental even then. 45 doctors that I had seen, the best of the best, neurology, infectious disease. No one really came up with anything other than a referral to a psychiatrist. I had a whole stack of cards to different psychiatrists. I was diagnosed chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia. Very little information was known about those conditions, what to do about them, what the root causes were. I think both of them, to some extent, are really labels for Lyme disease and mold illness and chronic viral activation, all of these things that we know a lot about now. There was some exploration into MS that was suggested by one of my practitioners. Finally, after I think it was Dr. 45, started over again. Fortunately, I had a PPO insurance, and so I didn't need to get referrals, and I just was, working through the list and trying to find someone that could help. The medical doctor that I started with referred me to an acupuncturist. She worked at an outlet mall. She was doing something called electroacupuncture according to Vol, electrodermal screening, EAV. And so this is really an energetic way of testing the body. And what he told me was the only thing that could be wrong with you is that you have bad food allergies. So go ask her what foods to avoid. And at the end of that 2-hour conversation and testing with her, that was at the time using a device called the Interactive Query System, which uses an electrodermal probe. And her response was, I think you should tell your doctor to test you for Borrelia, Bartonella, Babesia, Ehrlichia. Didn't really know. I probably knew. I had heard about Lyme disease. I knew there was, I think it was Irene on The Real World that had Lyme disease. And so I knew a little about it. I knew I had a tick bite, but no one really ever talked to me about it. So we did finally run several tests, and we were able to confirm what she suspected. I was then diagnosed with Lyme in 2005. And that experience of the energetic testing really got me very interested in energy medicine. It was not something at the time that I really understood. I was in the Silicon Valley software development realm, and it just seemed all a little too crazy for me. But it really did kind of, in my life, it really was an inflection point and kind of shifted things in another direction. Subsequently to that, a couple years later, started working through understanding the contribution of mold and mycotoxins to illness from Dr. Richie Shoemaker's book, Mold Warriors. Knew I was living in a place that for 10 years that it had significant mold, visible mold growing on the walls, and no one ever connected it. No one ever really said that could cause health problems. And so Lyme, mold, and lots of other pieces that we're going to talk about ultimately were all pieces of the puzzle. So none of what I'm going to talk about today is really original thought. It's my kind of how I've assimilated information from many of my mentors, Dr. Klinghardt, Dr. Neil Nathan, Dr. Amy Dirksen, Simon Yu, Raj Patel. I mean, just amazing people. And I've been super blessed to be connected to many of these people, sometimes wondering like, how am I even in the same room with these people? And it just really was amazing to see how the universe opened doors to learn from some of these brilliant minds. And so what I'm going to talk about, this 11-step health recovery model, it's a general framework. Doesn't mean the priority is going to be the same for everyone. Doesn't mean the order is going to be the same for everyone. I think it's a general kind of order that makes a lot of sense, but everyone's going to have slightly different issues that may shift the priority of certain steps. It's not something that I put together to, as I kind of mentioned earlier, to empower people to self-treat, but really more as a springboard for discussion with your doctors, with your practitioners, to think about things that maybe you hadn't talked about with them or explored with them. And it is changing and evolving. I mean, I think we're constantly learning more. If we went back 5-6 years ago, very few of us were talking about mast cell activation. If we went back a little bit before that, very few of us were talking about SIBO. If we go back just a few years ago, very few of us were talking about Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, for example. So there's constantly new things that we're all fortunately learning and understanding, and being able to then kind of shift and evolve things as we move forward. So what are the 11 steps as I understand them today? So the first step is always, in my mind, supporting detoxification and drainage. Critical. We have to open the drains as much as possible if our bucket is overflowing. So we'll talk more about how we might do that. Step 2 is looking at the external environment. Are we in a water intruded building? Are we getting exposed to mold and bacteria and mycotoxins and microbial VOCs? Are we dealing with high levels of electromagnetic fields, for example? All very, very critical. I think the first 2 steps here really do shift things significantly if done correctly. Step 3, optimizing sleep, just because it can exponentially increase the healing of all the other things that we're doing. Step 4 is more mental emotional. So we'll talk about emotional traumas and conflicts, how that might contribute to or even be the result of our illness. Step 5 is the limbic system, the vagus nerve, the autonomic nervous system. We cannot heal in a frazzled kind of hypersympathetic dominant response. We really need to do everything we can to calm the system down so that we set the stage for healing. Step 6 is the mast cell piece, the inflammation and immune modulation piece. So I used to think, killing the bugs was the most critical. If we can just kill the bug, I'm going to be better. I think the immune modulation piece is probably even more critical for most of us. It's not so much the bug that makes the disease, but it's how our host response is to the bug. If we're hypervigilant, autoimmune, overreacting, that's creating a lot of our symptoms. So we want to do what we can to modulate that response. Step 7 is foundational. What are we drinking? What are we eating? What's our microbiome look like? Step 8 is looking more at energy production with the mitochondria, with the adrenals, and also a couple of conditions that I think are commonly overlooked, cryptopyroluria being one that Dr. Klinghardt talks about. He and I have written a couple articles on that go into a deeper dive. And then what I would argue, particularly now, I would have argued this before the pandemic, but now I would argue hypercoagulation is probably the most overlooked issue that we experience and have not explored adequately. Step 9, finally, step 9 is let's, address some of the microbial pieces. People often wonder why it's so late in the process, but hopefully that's going to come together, and why this foundation is important. Step 10 is, what about the dental contributors? What if we do have cavitations? What if we do have root canals? For some people, this might be a step that needs to come much sooner if the dominant focus of their issues is more dental. But I think when we get to this step, having the foundation in place, supporting a lot of the microbial pieces and so on, that we're going to respond better to surgical interventions. We're going to heal better. We're going to have a better long-term result. So generally speaking, I still feel like this is kind of towards the end, but it may be earlier for some. And then step 11 is, now that we've been through years, decades, long periods of time, once we address all these issues, there could be some structural issues. There could be some restoration, regeneration, repair that we need to do. And so that's kind of the high level of the 11 steps. And then I'm going to go into a little more detail about each of them. So step 1 is detoxification and drainage. Again, I think this is the most important aspect of recovery. This is still an area that I focus on a lot. I think that most of us, if we were efficient in our detoxification and drainage, we probably would not have developed symptoms of illness to begin with. Much of our disease or dis-ease is the result, unfortunately, of the environment and the world around us. So I've said many times that improving the terrain is the road back. How do we clean up the terrain? It's also interesting that some organisms, like Candida, some people say Candida, either one. So some organisms like Candida or parasites, they may actually be present in the body to assist us in mitigating our toxic burden. So if we're heavy metal toxic, for example, they may be helping us at that point in time. So I think of detoxification and drainage support as also indirectly antimicrobial, that we're shifting the terrain so that we don't need some of these things to be present to protect us, which is probably that originated, I think, with Dr. Klinghardt, at least in my mind. And I would say that people don't think that some of these microbes actually may be helping us. It's important in this piece to minimize as much of the incoming toxic burden as possible. So what are you putting on your skin? What are you using for fragrances in your home? What are you using to wash your clothes? What are you doing to purify your air, your food, your water? All very critical. And that we also maybe need to think about toxins in the body from medical implants, whether those are dental implants, whether that's a knee, a hip, breast implants. I mean, all of those things potentially contribute to the toxic burden that we're trying to reduce in order to optimize the terrain. So detoxification and drainage, people use these words differently. I use detoxification more as a reference to binding agents. So if we have toxins in the body that are getting processed by the liver, put into the bile, move then into the gallbladder, ultimately that bile dumped into the small intestine, moves its way through the colon. If the enterohepatic recirculation or recycling of bile is also recycling the toxins that are in the bile, then you're not really getting appropriate excretion of those toxins. So we want to use these binders to bind to, it's not necessarily a tight bond. Sometimes these things will still drop out or drop off of these binders. Dr. Neil Nathan kind of says it's more like a magnet grabbing onto some iron shavings and kind of dragging it across a table. Many times starting with single ingredient binders, particularly in people that are dealing with ultra sensitivity, not tolerating things well, dealing with mast cell activation. Sometimes single ingredients can be a place to start. Bentonite clay can be very helpful, chlorella, activated charcoal, zeolite. I mean, there's a lot of different tools that we can use in this realm. I listed a few different brands here as well of ones that I've had some experience with. And then combination products. So companies that have taken many different kinds of binders and tried to consider how they might work together, how they might support the body more broadly. I actually love and still take every day the binders from Cellcore. So the Virad Chem, the biotoxin binder, HMET, for example. Part of what I love about these is you don't have to separate them from other supplements or from food. Pharmaceuticals, yes, they should still be separated, but it just makes things a lot easier when we're thinking about all the things and the regiment of our day. Other products that have been very helpful for people, GI Detox Plus from Biocidin, the Ultra Binder from Quicksilver based here in the Denver area as well. Nutrimetics has a newer one called Binder Plus. And then one that I recently really have started to like is called Charcoal Plus Binder from Designs for Health. That's a combination of charcoal, chlorella, and G-Pure zeolite. So drainage is a little different, and that is, how do we support the channels of elimination? How do we support the body's innate ability to process and excrete toxins? So we're thinking then about how do we optimize the liver, the gallbladder, the kidneys, the lymphatics, the extracellular matrix or ECM, also called the interstitium, kind of overlaps with the fascia, the colon, the skin, the lungs. We want to provide the body what it needs to do all of the things that it knows how to do well as efficiently as possible. So optimizing the exit routes, the emunctories is another term for that as well. We want to make sure we're not constipated if we're not having at least one, ideally 2 or more bowel movements a day. That's going to be a priority when we're thinking about how to optimize detoxification and drainage. The gallbladder is important too, from a perspective of what some, including Dr. Kelly Halderman and Dr. Chris Shade, talk about as phase 2.5 detox. So this is optimizing that liver, bile, gallbladder, small intestine flow that I was just talking about a minute ago, so that there are toxins to bind to when we take the binders that largely, not all, but largely stay in the gastrointestinal tract. Bile flow can be very helpful with that as well. So, taking bitters, for example, can be great. In the drainage realm, I tend to really like some of the homeopathic tools like Energetics, Drainage Tone, Hepatic Tone, Lymph Tone 2, Pacana, Live Calm, Mundipur, Iteres, Desbio, Systemic Drainage. Nutrimetics is actually not homeopathic, but there are some herbs now here on the slide as well. So their Berber or Berber Pinella product, absolutely great. And then single herbs like milk thistle, dandelion for liver and a little bit of kidney support, solidago for kidney support, red root for lymphatic support, and bitters that I talked about all can be very helpful. Minerals are another important part of the conversation. So trace minerals to really help the heavy metal conversation. So if we're mineral deficient, and sadly many or most of us probably are, the body's more likely then to hold on to heavy metals. So making sure that we're remineralized. Some minerals like silica, for example, can be really helpful with specific metals like aluminum, for example. It's important when we're doing detoxification and drainage work that we're getting movement. Stagnation is not helpful when we're trying to detoxify. We want to really be looking at fluid flows, lymphatic flow. Walking, probably one of the best things we can do for the lymphatics, for detoxification. I think it's highly underrated. I try to walk 3 or 4 miles a day. pretty much just an everyday part of my routine. So we want to have that movement to minimize stagnation and also to support the lymphatic system. And then there's a lot of other things we can bring in to support detoxification and drainage. So coffee enemas, top of my list of things that just made such a difference for me over the years, particularly with pain, inflammation. They were just magical. Colon hydrotherapy can be very helpful. Ionic foot baths, pulsed electromagnetic fields, castor oil packs, oil pulling, which is swishing oil around in the mouth and pulling some toxins out that way and then spitting it out. Liver gallbladder flushes, I think, also can be very powerful, but not everybody is going to be ready for those. Not everyone's going to tolerate them. There are some theoretical risks. So that's something that I think should be supervised by your practitioner, your doctor. And sauna can be helpful too, but I would say I generally find that it's better to do sauna later in the process rather than earlier. We might be sweating things out, but at the same time, we're also mobilizing toxins inside the body. So if we haven't appropriately supported the drainage piece that we've talked about, and we don't have binders on board, or our adrenals are not supported, or we're not able to sweat, sauna may actually be a stressor to the system rather than something beneficial. It's all about the right treatment for the right person at the right time. There is a time for sauna, but I don't think, generally speaking, we should be doing anything that doesn't feel supportive. If it feels like it's too much for us, then it probably is. And I would say the same about even the microbial support. I'm not in the camp or opinion that having long, prolonged, significant Herxheimer reactions is a good thing. I don't think that's the case. So broad detoxification and drainage support, I think, is really what we aim for early on. And then later, there might still be some specific things that were more significant for a given person, pesticides or chemicals or microplastics or heavy metals, where we might then need to kind of target things, shift things. But I think that's in addition to this kind of broad detoxification and drainage support that we just talked about. A lot of times we can use other homeopathics to kind of support the body in dealing with some of these issues as well. So step 2, this is the external environment, and our internal environment is only ever going to be as healthy as our external environment. If it is our external environment that is our kryptonite, and I think that is very commonly the case, then nothing that we do, I say, will be a significant needle mover. I used to say nothing we do is likely to return us to our superhero status, but I thought it was a little corny after a while. So the vast majority of people with chronic Lyme, in my experience, are also dealing with mold illness. And mold illness is very commonly the more significant factor. So I think we want to deeply explore the external environment before we start really getting too hyper focused on Lyme, which is kind of ironic for me to say because I'm probably more known for Lyme than even the mold conversation. But that was my personal experience and what I've seen with many people over many years now. So when we think about mold illness, it's not just mold and mycotoxins. It's a soup of toxins from water-damaged buildings. So we're thinking about mold and mycotoxins, but we're thinking about bacteria like actinos, which is newer to the conversation. Interestingly, actinos can actually be present in an environment without water damage or water intrusion. So that shifts things a bit to think that we could actually have SIRS or biotoxin illness without a roof leak or without a pipe burst or something along those lines. Endotoxins, those are bacterial cell walls. That gets us a little bit into the conversation around lipopolysaccharides, but those can be triggers for SIRS. And then a lot of these microbes are producing their own volatile organic compounds as well. When we're thinking about the environment, we need to think beyond just the obvious. So home, yes, common Office, yeah, happens. School, sadly, very common, I would say. I mean, many people, particularly, they they get better, they go off to college, and their dorm room ends up setting them back or causing a relapse. Cars can actually be a problem, and are often a trigger for people as well. It doesn't take a lot of exposure. And then what are the places that we're regularly visiting that might be sources of exposure, like going to the gym or sitting in a church that's been closed up with all of the environmental controls turned off all week, and probably too much humidity and all of those things, or a library, or antique stores, thrift stores, those kinds of places are going to be more suspect, and definitely things to consider. So how do we explore mold in the external environment? Self-testing is a reasonable place to start. It is not perfect. If we had unlimited access to resources, inspectors, money, self-testing isn't what I would do, but it is commonly where many of us need to start. So what are some of the things we can do from a self-testing perspective? ERMI, Environmental Relative Moldiness Index. HERTS-Me2 can be derived from the ERMI. So companies like Mycometrics or Envirobiomics do ERMI. Pretty easy to do that. Immunolytics gravity plates. That was actually my most recent podcast, was with JW Biava from Immunolytics. I don't think these replace the ERMI, but it's nice to, for $3 a plate, be able to put these plates out throughout your home, and see where do you have some potential issues, to be able to tap them on your mattresses, your pillows, your sofa, and get some visual indication for what might be growing. You can then send them to the lab and have them kind of tell you what's growing on the plates. The Real-Time Labs EMMA test is a subset of the ERMI from a mold perspective, but it also looks at some mycotoxins. So what if your Stachybotrys is growing behind a wall and is not coming out into your breathable space, but all of its mycotoxins are, then there's the potential that we miss that when we're looking at ERMI or even immunolytics, for example. So sometimes looking at mold and mycotoxins can be helpful. There are also some emerging tests in the bacterial realm, the actinos or actinomycetes and endotoxins. That's available through Envirobiomics. I wouldn't say that a lot of practitioners have incorporated that into their protocols from what I've seen. And what do you do about it if it's there? I think some of the better IEPs or indoor environmental professionals do know how to improve that. There's also environmental toxic assessment system, or ETA testing, which is one that I actually have done on my home when I moved to Denver a year ago. And so that includes an ERMI, but it also includes a lot of other things that you do. You do different kinds of air samples and go around room to room taking humidity levels and other things. And it's really insightful in looking at things beyond just mold. So for me, I mentioned VOCs here. VOCs were quite high. Very surprising. I did no VOC paint. I tried to, when I buy furniture, it's Green Guard certified. I mean, I try as much as possible to not be bringing things into my home that are going to be contributors to illness. But I had very high levels of gasoline and ethanol in my home. And lo and behold, turned out that that was from having an attached garage and parking your car in the garage. Like, that wasn't something I would have thought about. So that's another nice tool, just because it kind of find some things that others are maybe a little too hyper focused on. I think if we can, the preferred option is going to be to get an IEP. I have a link in the slides, and I'm happy to share these slides with your group, certainly. So ICI is a great resource for finding IEPs that understand chronic inflammatory response syndrome. That's the International Society for Environmentally Acquired Illness. Great group. I'm waiting for the day that they also start providing vetted remediators. I understand that's coming, where they can provide a list of people in different areas. So what do we do to improve the external environment from a mold and mycotoxin perspective? Well, we have a few options. One is going to be to remediate. We need to find someone that's worked with people with chronic illness. If they don't work with people with chronic illness every day, maybe not going to be the level of remediation that people like you and I might need. We need to identify the source of the mold growth or exposure and remove that from the environment. Leaving whatever the source is, not identifying the source, fogging, misting, all those kinds of things, not the complete solution. Fogging and misting can be helpful after you resolve the problem and remove the water intruded or water damaged materials. And then doing that as kind of a cleaning process as part of a small particulate cleaning can be helpful in some cases. But by itself, I do not believe that fogging is a solution. Second option would be to move. The downside of that is I've seen many people that have kind of gone from the frying pan into the fire, and testing, like we talked about a couple of slides ago, would be really critical before making a long-term commitment to a new environment. Third option would be avoidance. So, living in a tent in the backyard, RV trailer, those kinds of things. No doubt that kind of a strategy is going to be a needle mover for most people, but it's not always possible. It's not always practical. People have families or jobs or local support that they can't just, pick up and move like that to, maybe the desert, for example. Air filtration, not a complete solution unless, again, the source of the problem has been addressed first. It's icing on the cake. I tend to think of air filters, if we're trying to use those as a way to solve the problem, as kind of like standing in the shower trying to towel dry and never having turned off the water, or having a hole in the bottom of the boat, and rather than plugging the hole, trying to bail the water out with a paper towel. So this is a nice addition, but it's not going to solve the problem for most of us that have a chronic illness. So how do we look at the potential for mold in the internal environment? None of these are perfect tests. None of them are black or white. They're all different shades of gray. They're debated. There's, different camps on, oh, I don't like this, I do like that. I try not to be in any camp and just try to take the best from all the camps and hopefully put that together in some way. So urine mycotoxin testing, my primary mentor in this realm has been Dr. Neil Nathan. That's more of a direct test where we're looking for mycotoxins in the urine. In my experience, real-time labs has been the most helpful. Vibrant and Mosaic Diagnostics also offer urine mycotoxin testing, can be very helpful. The tests are debated. If you've eaten something with mycotoxins, isn't that going to come out in the urine? Yes, but the levels matter, the patterns matter. And then we could look at indirect tests. So my mycolab, for example, looks at antibodies to mycotoxins. Is your immune system seeing mycotoxins? There are some pathogen panels from Cyrex that also incorporate some of the molds. We can look at more mold allergy from a perspective of, let's say, the super mold immunoreactivity panel from Allotest, or even just doing regular LabCorp IgE mold testing. That's different than biotoxin illness, but they often overlap. And oftentimes people that have biotoxin illness also have mold allergy, but someone could have mold allergy and maybe not have biotoxin illness. So they're just kind of clues. In fact, I think it was one of the mold allergy tests early on, 2007, that kind of clued me into, oh my goodness, why do I have this many immune reactions to mold? And then we kind of figured out, oh, because you're living in mold. Great Plains, it's now Mosaic Diagnostics, but they also have an organic acids test that can give you some clues into the potential for fungal colonization. It's not a great test. I think we need some newer tools. The oat itself, to clarify, is a great test, but the application of that to try and determine whether or not fungus may be colonizing the sinuses or the gut and requiring then other types of treatment Not always perfect. In the shoemaker realm, some of the biotoxin illness markers, C4A, transforming growth factor beta 1, MMP9, MSH, they're very helpful, but they're not specific. So yes, if they're all, in this case, elevated, with the exception of MSH, which actually would be low, then that's a good indication something is going wrong. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's mold. It doesn't necessarily mean it's Lyme. So I think they can be helpful over time for tracking progress. But again, they're just another piece of the puzzle. Then we have the visual contrast sensitivity testing, which is another tool that can be done pretty easily, can be done online, survivingmold.com. That gives you a sense for whether or not you may have a biotoxin illness. Okay, so then in the internal environment, how do we improve this situation once we know that, yes, maybe we have had exposure, maybe we even have some colonization. Again, the colonization conversation is debated. Some deeply believe in it, some deeply do not believe in it. I do think that it happens. So detoxification support, binders to help remove or increase the excretion of mycotoxins, bentonite clay, charcoal, zeolites, chlorella, Saccharomyces boulardii can be helpful. Some of the pharmaceuticals like cholestyramine, Well-Call, those can be helpful as well. And then, a few of the ones I mentioned earlier, I do think the biotoxin binder from Cellcore is great because of my own personal history with mold and mycotoxins. That is one that I still continue to take. And then some of these broader ones that can also be helpful from a mycotoxin binding perspective. Drainage support, we talked about some of these already. So how do we support, optimize, make more efficient the body's ability to get rid of these things? And I mentioned most of these products earlier, with maybe the exception of Beyond Balance Pro Myco, which is an herbal formulation that can help support the body in getting rid of mycotoxins. Glutathione can be helpful if tolerated. Not everyone tolerates it, many do. Glucuronidation support. This is a phase 2 pathway through which mycotoxins and many other things are processed. So calcium D-glucarate, glucuronidation assist. There are tools that we can kind of support the body in optimizing that pathway that's going to help with the excretion of mycotoxins. And then we'll talk a little bit more in step 9, but some people may need antifungals as well. Sinus sprays, nasal sprays, antifungals that work within the gut, things like itraconazole, amphotericin B, nystatin, but we can also do things naturally here as well. Another piece of the conversation of step 2 is the EMF piece. So there is some conversation a lot from Dr. Klinghardt that EMF exposure can increase mold's virulence and its mycotoxin production in the home. That may be part of the reason we have so much more issue now with mold and mycotoxins is because of the increase in EMFs. If you were to ask Dr. Klinghardt, what's the first thing you should do if you have mold in your home? He's going to say, turn off your Wi-Fi. It's not the full solution, but it's certainly one not to be overlooked. We can get some self-testing meters like the Coronet or the Safe and Sound and, go through our homes and try to figure out what are the bigger sources of EMF exposure. Unfortunately, these days there are many, the dishwasher, the appliances that want to connect to the internet for whatever reason. So some EMF hygiene, I think, is very relevant and important. And if you really want to dig into this, getting a professional building biologist, and there are some links here where you can find people locally. The last one, Brian Hoyer and his group, they travel around the country. Probably one of the better known at really helping people with chronic illnesses to improve the EMFs in their environment in support of their health. And these are just some ideas for how we can improve EMFs in our environment. Mitigation is synonymous with reduction, most important piece here. Harmonization is icing on the cake, more difficult to prove, but certainly do help some people. So mitigation, we're talking about turning off Wi-Fi, being smart about how we use our cell phone, using a router that is very aware of how to minimize the EMF exposure. So the JRS Eco Wireless router definitely helps some people that are EMF sensitive. In some cases, sleep canopy. I actually slept in a Faraday cage for 16 years. Haven't needed to do that here, but that is certainly an option that can be helpful. Putting barriers on your cell phone and your laptop and things of that nature. In some cases, using EMF blocking paint can really help with what's coming in from outside. The problem is then if you're inside and a room has been shielded, then you don't want to have any electronics or phone or anything because it's potentially going to be amplified. Harmonization, again, do I do a few things in this realm? Yeah, occasionally I do. I mean, I wear a necklace more often when I go out than when I'm at home. They're harder to prove, though I think some companies are coming now to where they have done some more research. I've listed a few of them there. Somavedic, the Lila Heal Energy Capsule, which is the one that I'm currently wearing. Aries Tech, there's actually another company called Pranon that I learned about from Dr. Neil Nathan that I think there's going to be an interview with Beth O'Hara and Dr. Roger Billica as part of the upcoming Mastering Mast Cell Summit, where they're going to talk more about that. And Dr. Billica was a doctor supporting the space shuttle astronauts at NASA. And so I think I'm very interested to hear that talk and hear more of the science of why this might be helpful for people. Some of the supplements that can maybe help too: rosemary, propolis, the homeopathic that I mentioned here, EMF Protect and Balance can be great. Bodyguard Supreme from Supreme Nutrition. These don't mean that you don't minimize the exposures, but there are additional ways to support the body. Heavy metal detox is critical in minimizing EMF sensitivity. The more metals we have in the body, the more of an antenna we become. Definitely have seen people minimize their EMF sensitivity by detoxifying heavy metals. And then the limbic system piece, DNRS, Gupta, Primal Trust, those kinds of tools that can be really helpful in many types of hypersensitivities, including EMFs. All right, that was a long step 2. Step 3 is a little shorter. So that's optimizing sleep. And part of the reason this comes after step 2 is that EMF exposure is one of the major contributors to insomnia. So if we're having sleep problems and we're not turning our Wi-Fi off, I think we're missing the boat. Histamine definitely can dysregulate sleep. So we'll talk more about the mast cell and histamine piece in a little bit. But sometimes bringing in some of the antihistamines can be helpful. Common things people will have heard of: melatonin, GABA, 5-hydroxytryptophan, those kinds of things. Minimizing devices later in the day, having a dark, light blocking room, cold room. Some of the other things I think, though, that we don't always think about is, what is our blood sugar while we're sleeping? Is the blood sugar dropping to the point that then the body is creating cortisol to bring the blood sugar back up, but by the time the cortisol is, moving, surging through our veins, we're then going to be awake and not be able to sleep? What about oxygen saturation? If we're having some airway issues or sleep apnea, that's going to really keep the body in a sympathetic dominant kind of mode. It's going to affect our sleep. Weighted blankets, incline bed therapy can be helpful. Lots of devices now that have really been helpful in supporting people's sleep. BrainTap is one. The Apollo Neuro is another. The Nikki is another. So these are devices that use frequency, light, sound, vibration, those kinds of things to help really kind of calm the body and support sleep. And anything we can do in this realm is going to exponentiate or potentiate the other steps that we're talking about. Step 4 is the mental emotional contributors. And so traumas or conflicts, those definitely can set the stage for illness, or illness may be the trigger of the trauma. So as many times as I was told that, oh, it's all in your head, this is not a real condition. I'm not saying I didn't have traumas and conflicts before, because I absolutely did, but maybe it didn't. And you still need to work on step 4 because most of us will have some emotional trauma just from experiencing these health challenges. Doesn't mean it's all in our head. Mental, emotional contributors do lead to physical illnesses. My observation over the years has been that people with Lyme are often type A, perfectionist, overachievers, many times not feeling that we deserve to be well. I pride myself on having gone from type A plus to type A minus, and that was a lot of work, and I don't think it's ever going to get much better than that, but I think this is an important piece. The vast majority of people that I've talked to and been in communication with over the years that are dealing with chronic Lyme have been type A personalities. Cultivating healthy relationships, eliminating toxic ones, finding healthy joy, not identifying with the illness. It's a part of us, but it is not us. I never took on the label limey, never took on the label moldy. I don't think it's healthy for us to over-identify with the illness. Dr. Klinghart's 5 levels of healing model was very helpful in helping me to understand a lot of this. So probably you can find out more about that at klinghartinstitute.com, but essentially starts kind of a pyramid at the bottom: physical, energetic, mental, emotional, intuitive, and spirit. And so work that we do on this kind of mental, emotional realm is level 3 work, and that means that it cascades downward and has a very positive effect on the physical body. So work that we can do in this realm is going to be better than probably any supplement we can ever take. Some of the tools: EMDR, applied psychoneurobiology, which is Dr. Klinghart's work, emotional freedom technique, NET, emotion code. A great book for people that are open to this work is Amy Scher's book, How to Heal Yourself When No One Else Can. Really goes a lot into very practical things you can do that include certain statements, certain tapping, to help release the cellular imprint of emotional trauma on our body, on our cells. It's an amazing resource. Step 5, retrain the limbic system and tonify the vagus nerve. This is all kind of in the autonomic nervous system realm. If we think of the limbic system, it's the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, the amygdala. It's the alarm center or safety switch or safety detector, anxiety switch. It's kind of surveilling the environment, and it really has impact on our immune system, our hormonal system, our autonomic nervous system, that goes further into blood pressure, heart rate, breathing, digestion, all of that. The limbic system can be impaired by mold exposure, chemicals, pesticides, bacteria, viruses, physical, mental, emotional trauma. Not always mental, emotional, though. This can be entirely biologic in terms of the trigger for the impairment. If we think about maybe mold in our home as a tiger, we remediate, we do all the right things. So now it's kind of more like a kitten walking outside the window. But if the limbic system still sees that kitten as a tiger, then we still have that same stress response. And so essentially we want to use limbic system tools like DNRS, Gupta, Primal Trust. I mentioned here on the slide too, brain tap and frequency specific microcurrent also can be helpful. So we want to use tools like that to reboot, as Dr. Nathan would say, or recalibrate the perceived stress to the actual threat level. We don't want to perceive something as a tiger if it's really a kitten. I think there are cases where doing this work quite early can be helpful for those that are really sensitive and not tolerating supplements or treatments. But for the most part, I think you want to address the tiger first, and then you use this kind of rebooting tool later in the process. Kind of depends on what the goal is. Vagus nerve, very important, supporting the digestive function, with the vagus nerve, part of the autonomic nervous system, calming the system. So a few tools that I mentioned here that can be helpful in that realm: Safe and Sound, which was created by Dr. Porges, Heart Math, the Rosenberg exercises from his book, Accessing the Healing Power of the Vagus Nerve, cranial sacral, good body work can really help. And again, brain tap and frequency specific microcurrent, various systems of tapping as well. So the core of this is that we cannot heal if we're in a fight, flight, or freeze mode. We have to calm the system in order to rest, digest, detoxify, and heal. Step 6, this is the modulation step. So if we're dealing with mast cell activation, we're dealing with histamine, we've got a lot of inflammation, our immune system is just on high alert. Health is not about killing bugs, but the host response is what makes the disease. And if we have a hypervigilant, overactive, autoimmune immune response, that's creating a lot of our symptoms. Much of that inflammation can be driven by mast cell activation, by histamine. Mast cell activation can be triggered by probably the top few: mold, parasites, EMFs. Lyme, Bartonella can certainly trigger mast cells, lots of environmental toxicants, medication, supplements, foods. I'm sure we've all had that experience of not tolerating something that we're trying to use to get better. Even things like changes in temperature or any kind of mental, emotional, or physical stress can be triggers for mast cells. This last statement is something I heard Dr. Theo Theoharides say at a conference many years ago now, but even then it kind of shocked me, that mast cells are 10 times more active in the presence of a cell phone. I'm just, that's amazing. I mean, if you just get your cell phone away from your body, you're helping your mast cell activation syndrome. Pretty remarkable. So low histamine diet trial can be immensely helpful. People often notice some symptoms resolve or the vast majority significantly improve. Things that we used to think were healing, like kombucha, avocados, bone broth, fermented foods, collagen, probiotics, they may not be our friend. Again, right place, right time, right person. And most of us early on need to avoid these things if we're dealing with any mast cell or histamine issues. Once we've addressed the dietary piece, then we think about how do we stabilize the mast cells. So things like quercetin, luteolin, holy basil. There's products available like Neuroprotect from Dr. Theo, Probiotic Histamine X from Dr. Ben Lynch, HistaAid from Dr. Chris Shade, HistaQuell from Research Nutritionals, Ketotifen, Chromalin, lots of different DAO products that can all be helpful in stabilizing the mast cells and doing supporting histamine reduction. Certainly also some of the H1, H2 blockers, the Claritins and Allegras and Zyzols and famotidine, those kinds of things as well. We also want to think about other ways to reduce inflammation, pro-resolving mediators or SPMs, fish oil, curcumin, plasmalogens, maybe can all be supportive of inflammation reduction. How do we modulate the immune system? If the immune system is overactive, or Th1, Th2, Th17, Treg, all of that is dysregulated, what are some tools we can do to bring back some appropriate response? Low dose naltrexone, low dose immunotherapy, homeopathy, black seed oil for me is a personal favorite, as is low dose immunotherapy. Products like IM and Calm. I really like the Holo Immune product in this realm now as well. That's from a company here in Boulder, Healthy Gut, Steve Wright. Peptides can be helpful in modulating the immune system as well. The BPCs, the KPVs, the amlexinoxes, those kinds of things. So many times over the years, I've heard people say, oh, I just need to boost my immune system and then I'll be able to deal with these microbes. But boosting the immune system more often than not is going to make things worse. The goal really is to modulate, to calm, to create integration or tolerance with our microbiome. So step 6, I think, is probably far more important than what we'll talk about in step 9. We need to really shift how we respond to these bugs, because we're not ever getting rid of them completely, nor should we want that to be a goal. Step 7, just some basic things: hydration, nutrition. What about our microbiome, our gut? So hydration, many people with SIRS or biotoxin illness are drinking water all day, peeing all day, still cellularly dehydrated because of low antidiuretic hormones. So what do? We want to start with pure water. For me, that's distilled. For some, it's reverse osmosis. For others, it's using a filter, like Clearly Filtered, one of the pitchers that's pretty easy to use. Adding in some electrolytes, some trace minerals, some sea salts, some cell salts, those kinds of things. Homeopathics like rehydration from energetics can help as well with being able to be more cellularly hydrated. And then lots of tools now for structuring water. So how do we kind of simulate water moving through a stream so that it is structured in a way that it then will be more hydrating? So those are just a few ideas there from a perspective of hydration. And then nutrition, I think one of the most important things that we need to do here is removing those foods that are triggering us. I think the vast majority, in fact, I'll change that statement. I think all of us need to be gluten-free. I think the vast majority of us need to be cow dairy free, processed sugar free, and high histamine food aware, and minimizing those things. Diets are going to be very individualized, but I would say the one that most consistently seems to help is a low histamine diet. There's a lot of talk recently too about many people with significant gut issues doing pretty well with the carnivore diet. Still some debate about short-term, long-term with the carnivore diet. I also think that having the things that we are eating be as highly nutrient dense as possible. So for me, my morning shake is like my favorite thing of the day. Healthy protein, lots of fats. I mean, literally a couple tablespoons of fats, 4 tablespoons or so of different fibers, maybe some pre or probiotics if people tolerate those. So how are we really supporting the body and getting good nutrition? Looking at the microbiome, what can we do to optimize the biome? So Megaspore Biotic has been a favorite for many years now, seems to be tolerated by the vast majority of people with mast cell activation or SIBO. Also helps support step 6 with the immune modulation and inflammation reduction. Bifidobacteria can be very helpful. This is based on some of the work from Dr. Sabine Hazan. Many probiotics, unfortunately, are histamine promoters. So we can take probiotics and feel worse because they're maybe triggering histamine, triggering our mast cell activation issues. So there are some probiotics out there like Probiotic Histamine X, Smidge Sensitive, a few others that can be quite nice for people that are dealing with histamine issues as well. Kind of building on microbiome, thinking of the gut health, so avoiding those things that are triggering the intestinal hyperpermeability, probably the most significant being mold and mycotoxin exposure, and then some of the foods that we talked about. Bringing in maybe butyrate as a postbiotic to support the lining of the gut. Ion biome or ion gut support is another tool that can really help with the lining of the gut. BPC 157 also can be very helpful for supporting the gut. And in some cases, colostrum. Few people, I was one of those, that can get inflammation triggered by colostrum, but it can also be quite nice for supporting gut health and immune health. All right, step 8. So step 8 is about energy production and also KPU and coagulation. So Probably a few years ago, we would have led with a conversation on the adrenals. We would talk about the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal thyroid axis. It may be that it's more HPAT axis dysfunction than really that the adrenals themselves are exhausted. But one of the goals, and this is kind of terminology from Dr. Isabella Wentz, is how do we add safety signals into our routine and how do we remove danger signals? Kind of going back to what I was saying about calming the system, calming the nervous system, facilitating a healthier stress response. We can certainly use things like ashwagandha, holy basil. Holy basil does a lot in a lot of different steps, the mast cell activation piece, the antifungal piece, the adrenal piece. So lots of things we can do in that realm. But I would say more recently, probably in the last 3-4 years, maybe 5 years, and some of this coming from Dr. Todd Watts, the importance of the mitochondria here for energy production, that we need cellular energy to detoxify, for the body to function, to repair. So things like red light or photobiomodulation, maybe CoQ10, maybe PQQ, methylene blue, NAD, lots of NAD precursors that we can consider as well. We want to go slow and low when we're supporting mitochondria. Sometimes, if the body is still in a cell danger response, that is protective because there is still a tiger present generally. If we're trying to push on the accelerator when the body is trying to pump the brakes, we can trigger some detox reactions. We can actually make things a little bit worse. So I think mitochondrial support is important, but we don't want to be too aggressive. We want to use the type A- approach rather than what I did for many years. KPU, again, cryptopyrroluria. Learned about this from Dr. Klinghardt. I think first or second year that I started working with him. I was a patient of his for about 6 years, from 2006 to 2012. This is when the body is peeing out B vitamins and zinc, and that leads to white blood cells that really just can't respond appropriately. So our immune response is ineffective. Dr. Klinghardt likes to say it's like the white blood cells have become an army with no bullets. So in incorporating zinc and B vitamins, we want to be slow and low. We can really trigger some strong detox reactions, some metal releases, and so on. I did this way too aggressively. There's no reason to do that. It is definitely a marathon and not a sprint. And then Dr. Klinghardt has found this to be a very common 80% or more condition in people with Lyme, with autism, with similar neurological conditions. The coagulation or hypercoagulation piece that I mentioned earlier, I think that's really, maybe I should change this to say likely rather than possibly. It's likely the most commonly missed aspect of chronic illness, particularly now in the pandemic era, where people are hypercoagulated, hyperviscous, blood clots, microcirculatory issues. Can be triggered by mold, triggered by babesia, triggered by heavy metals, triggered by COVID. So it's important here to do some testing to get a good baseline and then kind of track progress. A lot of times people are using enzymes like nattokinase or Baluch or serrapeptase, but there are pharmaceutical options like heparin, Lovenox, Xarelto, and so on that may be appropriate as well. I encourage people, if you've not explored coagulation as part of your Lyme and mold journey, to talk to your doctor about just doing some testing to see if that might be something worth looking at more deeply. Finally, kill the bugs. So step 9, again, it's at the end because killing the bugs is not the priority. It's very intentional. Once we do get here and we have this foundation in place, what's the order? And this is somewhat based on Dr. Klinghardt, somewhat adapted. I tend to think about starting with supporting the viral the EBV, the HSVs, the herpes zoster, all of those things, and the retroviral activation early, because I think they produce a lot of our symptoms, and I also think the interventions are generally well tolerated. Then kind of working from larger to smaller, so larger parasites, working with the gut, the SIBO, the CFO, the fungus, the mold, the yeast, then the Lyme and co-infections, maybe biofilms, maybe not. So that kind of is more at the end. If we're thinking about reactivation of viruses, which has also become much more common now in those dealing with COVID, and the activation of endogenous retroviruses that we all have, but are worsened primarily by EMF exposure. I've listed a number of the tools that I've liked over the years: BioPure, the NV, or the Cystis, or the IMNV2 or 3 from Beyond Balance, the Virad Chem, sulforaphane, selenium, lysine. There's lots of homeopathics here as well. So those are just some ideas. Melissa or lemon balm would be another one to think about, maybe. And then we're thinking about, okay, what about the parasites, and what about all the gut dysfunction? Parasites are very difficult to find. We don't have to have traveled outside of the US. In my experience, it's best to screen with multiple tools. I really like Para-Wellness Research for testing for parasites. They happen to be here in Aurora. Dr. Raphael D'Angelo looks at stool and urine under the microscope, very commonly does find parasites. Some of the other labs, hit or miss. So I like to combine with different systems of energetic testing, whether that's the Zyto or the Quest 4 or the acupuncture meridian assessment or Dr. Klinghart's autonomic response testing. We're just looking for different lenses or different pieces of information to try to see what might be going on. So when we talk about parasites, parasites can be larger nematodes or helminths. They can be smaller protozoa as well. A few of the products that I like, I mentioned here, Dr. David Jernigan created Paragen. Beyond Balance has Paralevier. Cellcore has Para 1, 2, 3, 4. I like using homeopathy as well, like Unda 39. And in some cases, Dr. Klinghart and Dr. Simon Yu, who have been two of my top mentors, they are going to suggest that pharmaceuticals make a lot of sense in dealing with parasites, whether that's Alinea, albendazole, praziquantel or biltricide, pyrantyl palmoate, lots of different pharmaceuticals that can be ivermectin, can also be helpful when we're talking about parasites. When we're treating parasites, we can then, as I alluded to in step 1, we can release heavy metals into the system when those are being killed off. So we want to make sure we still have detox and drainage and binders and all those things in place as well. SIBO, in my lens or way of thinking, I think it's less about the bug and more about the nervous system, more about the vagus nerve, more about bile flow, which really acts as a detergent in the intestinal tract. Antimicrobials do not commonly resolve SIBO long-term. SIBO can be CFO as well, where there's a bacterial component and a fungal component. If we're looking at dysbiosis, which can certainly be helpful in treating SIBO if we're thinking about all those other pieces that I mentioned. Biocidin can be great, Megaspore Biotic, IMNGI from Beyond Balance, Herb Farm, intestinal tract defense, Cellcore Para 4. I mean, there's a lot of great tools that can be helpful. But if we're really having a lot of gut issues, we want to think beyond just killing the bug and a lot towards the nervous system, the bile flow, the vagus nerve, and so on. Fungus, yeast, and mold. So this could be the Candida or Candida conversation, but it could also be that exposure in a water damaged building to Aspergillus has led to some sinus gut colonization that we then have an internal mycotoxin production factory. Same thing with the parasites. If we're killing fungus, we're probably releasing metals into the system. Some of my favorite tools in this realm are a Limbic from Research Nutritionals, Global Healing, Mycozil, Mega Mycobalance, which comes from the Megaspore Biotic Company, which is Microbiome Labs, SF722 from Thorn, which has been renamed now to undecilinic acid. Beyond Balance has MycoRegen. And then I mentioned earlier, sometimes pharmaceutical antifungals, itraconazole, amphotericin B, nystatin, those kinds of things have a role as well. The challenge is it's not super easy to, there is really not a good test for knowing whether someone's colonized or not. So you have to kind of look at the urine mycotoxins, look at the environmental testing. If their environment is believed to be no longer a source of exposure, but they still have urine mycotoxins, well, are those coming from inside the person? And regardless of how clean their external environment is, they may still need to address the internal environment in that scenario. Lyme and co-infections. So here we're talking about Borrelia, Bartonella, Babesia. We're talking about some opportunistic infections as well, like mycoplasmas or chlamydias. I tend to like to start with more targeted interventions and then going broader later. So looking at things like some of the products from Byron White formulas or Beyond Balance or Nutrimetics, where they're more targeted for, let's say, Bartonella or Babesia or Borrelia, where you can kind of work through the layers of the onion one at a time. And then later using something broader, whether that's like the cocktail product from BioPure or ENLTX from Beyond Balance or Crypto Plus from Research Nutritionals or Mike P from Research Nutritionals, some of these really broader ones. I think sometimes that can be a little too much when we're starting out right at the beginning, that we want to be a little more methodical about that. And then maybe some people do need some biofilm support. If you've treated and you're feeling great and you stop treatment and things start coming back, maybe there are some sequestered or hidden organisms that are not able to be reached by the immune system or by the things that we're taking. And maybe then we need to do some work with biofilms. But sometimes biofilm interventions can be opening Pandora's box. They can trigger mast cell activation. I don't think it's always necessary, but there will be some cases where we need to think about biofilms. And then again, later, using broader tools, broader spectrum herbs and herbal formulations. Sometimes people just are really not able to tolerate a lot of oral interventions. And so what else can we do as an adjunct in those cases? We can't just throw up our hands and, hope that they can tolerate them in the future. So some other interventions that could be helpful: ozone, a big fan of ozone. I think ozone therapies are great. INPT or induced native phage therapy, still evolving. That's a tool currently being evolved by Dr. David Jernigan. I'm hopeful that at some point that will be available to all of our practitioners. It's not yet the case. Frequency devices like the Wave 1, for example. Homeopathy, lots of homeopathic tools in this realm. DesBio has a number of homeopathic tools that we can incorporate as well for dealing with kind of addressing these microbial overgrowths. All right, step 10, almost there. So thinking about the dental contributors, the amalgams, the root canals, the cavitations, I think most people, again, this is, based on Dr. Klinghardt, Dr. Simon Yu, most people probably do better if we first have addressed the retroviral activation and the parasites before we do, let's say, a surgical cavitation procedure. The response to the procedures, the healing process, the lasting improvements are going to be better if we have the foundation in place first. Cavitations are sadly more common than recognized, and finding a good biological dentist. I'm actually pleasantly surprised here in the Denver Boulder area. There's a lot of good biological dentists and a lot of them that know about and work with cavitations. But in many places, that's not the case. So doing a CBCT, looking at that for the potential of cavitations, which usually are going to be in places where teeth were previously removed, most commonly the wisdom teeth. Sometimes the tonsils need to be considered. If we're talking about a child with pandas, where strep is a component, or even PANS, still likely strep is a player there as well. So maybe we need to think about the tonsils. And then what can we do to improve the health of the oral biome, which then affects the systemic biome? So things like dental Sidon from the Biocidin company, some essential oil blends like Oral Defense, oil pulling that we talked about. There's more and more probiotics like Oramax that are coming out that can be helpful for supporting the biome of the mouth as well. And I guess one of the other pieces that I would say here is these decisions are not ones that should be taken lightly. I have seen people get too aggressive in working with the dental pieces and become significantly worse. It's very important that there is deep coordination between your dentist or surgeon and whoever your doctor, or what I call the captain of your ship. We need to make sure that everybody's on the same page about, is it the right time? Is now a good place in your protocol to do it? How does your protocol need to change to support you from the potential of a surgical stress activating some microbes that might still be in your system? So all of those things worth having very, very good coordination if you're going to move down that path. Step 11 is supporting regeneration and restoration. So Dr. Jernigan, he talks about the analogy of termites. So once the termites are gone, gone means minimize, not affecting us. Again, I don't think we're ever getting rid of Borrelia, Bartonella, Babesia, but I actually find that quite empowering because it's not super achievable, and I'm glad we don't need to do that to be healthy again. There could still be some structural damage left. I mean, if you have termites and you bag your house and you do the fumigation and all that stuff, well, there's still going to be damage to the wood after the termites are gone. So what are some things that we can do to support restoration, repair? Hormone replacement therapies may have a role. I think this also could come earlier, but with the thought process that sometimes the body is intelligent about downregulating the thyroid or testosterone or something like that as a protective mechanism. Phospholipids, amazing, like fats, lots of good healthy fats. So phosphatidylcholine, I put that in my shake every morning. We can do IV phosphatidylcholine, what's called the PK or Patricia Kane protocol, to really restore cell membranes. Plasmalogens, which are another type of lipid, can also be very helpful in supporting the cell walls and thus really supporting repair and restoration. A lot of the peptides, BPC 157 and others that can really support restoration, regeneration as well. Light therapy or photobiomodulation can support the mitochondria, can support our collagen that can be greatly affected by Borrelia and Bartonella, providing us with support for the thyroid, providing us with more photons or vital force. Stem cells, exosomes, I'm waiting to see that continue to evolve. I think for localized issues, if there's a knee problem, hip problem, joint problem, something like that, there may be a place for it. Years ago, we used to kind of talk about stem cell therapies more systemically in the realm of kind of Lyme and autism and those kinds of things. I haven't found it particularly helpful in the chronic Lyme arena as a systemic intervention. And if someone was going to do it, this very late in the process would be what I would think about rather than, earlier. Other tools might be some of the oxygen-based therapies. So like exercise with oxygen therapy, Live02 is one of those, is a tool that I used every day for like a year before I moved here, but then now it's too beautiful to be inside. So I walk 3 or 4 miles a day outside instead. But when the snow comes, then you'll find me on my EWAT. Hyperbaric oxygen also could be another tool. I can't say that I've seen it super consistently helpful in chronic Lyme for, treating Lyme, so to say. But I think as a restorative, regenerative tool, that could be another tool to explore as well. I did want to mention, just because we're a Colorado group, and I just found out about this yesterday. So I'm actually one of the ambassadors for Ravel Health. They're based here in Colorado. They just kicked off their Colorado pilot program. It's all virtual. They're pairing up patients with practitioners. They do have a few spots remaining in the pilot that they just launched, which is really to kind of evolve their process and eventually roll this out much more broadly than Colorado early next year. So they reached out to me yesterday and said, hey, we have a couple spots available. If you want to share them with people, if you want to learn more about that, the link is there for you as well. And with that, I actually am impressed that my voice largely held out since I yesterday overused it a bit. So any questions that you all have, I hope you found that helpful. And again, there's a lot that I've learned over the years, and there's a lot that I've learned that I don't know. So we're all constantly learning. And if you have pieces that you found helpful and you want to share those with me, I'd love to hear. You can certainly reach me through my website or just Scott at BetterHealthGuy.com. I'd love to connect with any or all of you. Thank you.
And if anybody has any questions, we're going to do a quick Q&A until 4 o'clock. So if you would please put any questions in the chat, we will read those to Scott.
I see one that popped up there, but I'm going to wait until I know you guys are going to ask me the question. So
yeah, it just says please. That's so.
No, I see. Exactly. I see a question there.
Yeah, I see it. It says, "Is IVIG helpful? Blood products equals skin."
It's a good question. I don't have a lot of experience with it. I think you would want to first test to see if you do truly have an immunoglobulin deficiency or something like CVID, chronic variable immunodeficiency. I would say it's more common that I hear of people exploring IVIG in the PANS and PANDAS realm, kind of higher dose to calm autoimmune responses. It can be very expensive, can be tens of thousands of dollars. It can be very difficult to get coverage for IVIG in many scenarios. It is a blood product, so that's something we always had to think about. Could it also have been a source of other infections? Certainly people in the pandemic era are talking about things like IVIG again, and considering the impact of what might or might not be in them, or what the donors might have have been exposed to, and things of that nature. So I can't say in adults in the Lyme and mold arena that I've super commonly heard that be a game changer, but if you have a true immunodeficiency, then that may change the conversation. So I would explore that with your doctor, see if you do have something like CVID or some type of an immune deficiency where it makes sense. It is still a tool that can be used in kids dealing with PANS and PANDAS, and in some cases can be helpful.
Okay, Gary, did you get my message back about Ravel? Okay, yeah, Gary had a question about Ravel's website, and I believe it's ravel.health.
Yeah.
/pilot.
Perfect. Yeah, I see you got it in there. That's right. Yep.
Okay, our next question is from Michelle. Can you please recommend holistic biological dentists? Boulder/Denver. Can you recommend an ionic foot bath? Do you have thoughts on using Rife machines?
Okay, Michelle, good questions. So First, I can just give you some insights on dentists based on what I know. I've only been in the area for a year. I don't know all the options, and some of them are not going to come to my mind. But I have had good experiences with Dr. Carmen Burke's office in Boulder. Their entire office has just been great. Dr. Anna Jumtina, Dr. Burke, Dr. Brown. I think they're very leading edge. There's also the office that Dr. Corbin Pop works out of as well, that I've heard very good things about. I think another one is called Colorado Biodentist, also very good. So, I came from kind of Northern California a year ago, and we had a couple of good biological dentists, but not a lot. And here I'm super impressed. I don't know what it is about people's teeth here or just knowledge. I mean, in general, I think the functional and integrative medical community here in the Denver Boulder area is super impressive. So possibly think about Dr. Carmen Burke or Dr. Corbin Pop or Colorado Biodentist. Those are a few that come to mind. Ionic foot baths. Yeah, the one that I have used is the Ion Cleanse from A Major Difference. It is not inexpensive. They've done a lot of studies on looking at, metals and mycotoxins and glyphosate and all those things. I do think it's a good system. I don't think that the color of the water matters. I don't think that the vast majority of the benefit is because anything is coming out through our feet. I think that these systems are supporting or upregulating or improving the efficiency of our detoxification and drainage over a period of days afterwards. So I use the one from A Major Difference. Dr. Klinghardt has also talked about the one from Key Science, which is a UK-based company. It is a cheaper system. I don't have experience with it personally, but I know that Dr. Klinghardt, looks for and uses high-quality products. There was also a company from Canada that for a while I think was also quite good. I should say for a while I was hearing more about, and I think is still quite good, called Platinum Energy Systems. But A Major Difference is the one I personally use. Do I have thoughts on Rife? I've used a lot of them over the years, the GB4000, the Resonant Light Pearl, probably 3 or 4 others. I have not personally been super excited about Rife. It's not on my top 10 list of things that I would find helpful. I think it's a little bit like a slot machine. If you get the right frequencies and they kind of affect your microbes in some way, then for me, when I used to do this more regularly, and I would go to the office, and I always tried to not take the elevator. I would push myself to take the stairs. And on days after I used Rife and it actually seemed to have some effect, there was no way I was going to walk up 5 flights of stairs and I would have to take the elevator. But I find it's very hit or miss. So I'm much more drawn to tools now like the Wave 1, which I have used for about 5 years and I still use, kind of looks like this, still use it regularly. So I think there's other tools and form factors that are kind of evolving using frequency. Healy is another that many people like. It's a multi-level marketing kind of thing, which was a little bit of a turnoff for me, but people have had good response to Healy as well. So not a huge fan of Rife, but I am a huge fan of frequency, light, sound, vibration, those types of tools. So I think we're kind of evolving a little bit beyond just Rife. One of the tools that some people do find helpful that's kind of in that Rife arena is called Spooky 2. I played with it myself for a while. It's evolved quite a bit since I originally played with it, but that's kind of my thoughts on your questions, Michelle. Thanks.
Okay, and then we have I think it's a question. We're trying to figure this out.
Okay.
Gary was asking, I have seen so many practitioners, oral and IV antibiotics, IVIG supplements, now trying acupuncturist who uses Avatar machine to come up with frequencies to treat pathogens using full laser on different areas of body for Lyme, mold, EBV.
So, I mean, I like that idea. Avatar is an electrodermal screening device similar to what I was talking about at the very beginning of the presentation. Avatar is one of the tools that Dr. Simon Yu has used along with the Mora device and the Kindling and some others. So it sounds like what I was kind of talking about, which is a hesitation with Rive, it's like, well, how do you figure out which frequencies your body has a preference for such that those frequencies may have some benefit? And if you can use something like good muscle testing or the Avatar or whatever to figure out how your body responds to certain frequencies and then deliver those frequencies using some kind of a device, to me, that makes a lot more sense rather than saying, okay, body, here, I'm going to give you all these frequencies. Some may be helpful, some may be stressful, some may do nothing. If you know ahead of time that the body has a biological preference for certain frequencies, then to me, that makes a lot of sense. That's incorporating biofeedback with the delivery of frequencies. So yeah, and I would say with many of these things, like I don't know who the acupuncturist is, but tools are tools. And I would say if this person is having a lot of success, it's also because they have a gift in doing what they're doing. If we gave a hammer and nails and wood to many people and asked them to go build a house, and you gave that to me, you better find a nice bridge to keep you covered because I'm not going to be able to help too much. So I think these tools are great. I like what you mentioned here. I like the idea then of using cold laser. And if this person's getting success, I would also speculate that it's because they have some gifts in that realm as well.
Okay, we have a question from Amy. Dr. Kent Holtorf talks about mast cell, and he recommends going upstream and using peptides to treat mast cell. Do you recommend both treating mast cell traditionally and with peptides?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've had Dr. Holtorf on the podcast. I think there's lots of different ways to solve a problem. So yes, using some of the peptides like BPC 157, like KPV, like amlexinox, maybe even thymosin beta 4. Some of those things can be helpful in working with the mast cell activation piece. So if that's kind of that, I know Dr. Holtorf, the peptides are a major piece of what he does. Many other practitioners incorporate them, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's a major piece or that they're peptide experts, so to say. So I think there are cases where you can still use peptides and other, quercetin, luteolin, antihistamines, those kinds of things. So I don't think it has to be one or the other. But yeah, I think the peptides, I talked about that on that immune modulation mast cell piece as tools that are emerging. It's a little tricky. I mean, ideally, you do want to work with someone that's used them a lot. It's also a little tricky with some of the peptides because the ones that seem to become more popular become harder to get and are not always readily available to us anymore. But yeah, I think peptides are phenomenal. And in fact, I would say step 6, the modulation piece, and step 11 are probably where the peptides are going to shine the most in the 11 steps that we just talked through.
Okay, and then we have a question from Sarah. She wants to know, can you recommend a coach for those of us who are working with practitioners who are not moving the needle?
That's a good question. I mean, as my schedule allows, I do some coaching. It wasn't something I was really even going to mention here, but you can certainly reach out to me, and if I can help in some way, I'm happy to explore that. I would say functional diagnostic nutrition practitioners, FDNs, there are many FDNs that are very, very bright and also have experienced themselves Lyme and mold and those types of things. So maybe reaching out to the FDN organization. I'm not sure if they have a list of practitioners on their website or not, but if you want to email me, Sarah, I may be able to connect you with a couple of options there, and I'm happy to answer any questions as well.
This is from Amy. Are there any of these tests and treatments covered by insurance? Do you have any recommendations for affording treatment for those unable to work due to Lyme/health issues?
Yeah. I mean, this is always a challenge. Unfortunately, a lot of these conditions are not inexpensive. But yeah, I mean, I still think there are things you can do. Are any of the tests or treatment covered by insurance? Yes. There are still, I'm actually surprised. I can think of one clinic here in Denver that works with people with Lyme and mold that does take insurance. Shockingly, I would say, quite honestly, most practices probably cannot really financially sustain themselves with what they get reimbursed from insurance. So the vast majority of practitioners in this realm have had to go to more of a private pay model. And then you, depending on your insurance, can still file a super bill and get some coverage. So yeah, a lot of the tests, depending on your insurance, certainly the possibility of getting some reimbursement, but it is going to depend on if you have an HMO or a PPO, if you need a referral, what do they cover? The other challenge is a lot of the deductibles are very high. So even if they do cover it, you barely reach the deductible by the end of the year before it resets again. Affording treatment for those that are not able to work. If I was going to put my money in any one area, I would explore as much as possible the potential for mold in the environment. Unfortunately, a lot of times people, stop working because they're sick, maybe in part because they had mold exposure in their home. Now they're home all the time. And then, the source of their problem is actually something that they have more exposure to. But yeah, I mean, if you're wanting to look at, what can you do, I would think about a binder. In fact, I remember Dr. Klinghardt years ago, and maybe he would change this now, but he'd say, if you needed to do things more inexpensively, he would think about chlorella, garlic, freeze-dried garlic, and fish oil. So, I mean, there are certainly some things that you could incorporate. Again, not encouraging self-treatment. I think we all need a doctor. I think these conditions are very, I see the Z dental here as well. That's another one that, thanks, Gary. I think these are challenging conditions. I think we can sometimes get ourselves into difficult situations by trying to self-treat and not having a guide in this area. I think, we're very fortunate to have many. And I don't know that I want to mention a specific Lyme practitioner here, but I know there is at least one clinic that does take insurance. And if helpful, Amy, if you want to email me, I'm happy to share that information as well.
Do we have any other questions? I don't think I see anything. Let's see. Yeah, other than Sarah had a comment in the chat, not necessarily, it looks like a question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't see anything else. Does anybody have any other questions for Scott today before we wrap up?
Hey, Joanne, there's one more that just came in from Amy. I'll go ahead and
there it is. Just popped
I'll
up.
go ahead and grab it. Yeah, I'll grab it.
Okay.
My Lyme symptoms got worse after the COVID vaccine and are still worse. Do you have any recommendations for COVID and Lyme?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not an expert on COVID. I don't know that anyone is, but many are becoming out of necessity. I would say what comes to mind would be checking the FLCCC website, flccc.net. They do have a number of protocols that have been put together by Dr. Pierre Corey, Dr. Paul Merrick, and their group for COVID, long COVID, COVID vaccine related issues. And then Dr. Bruce Patterson, in fact, he just did, I think it's now available on their website. He just did a webinar a week or two ago that I attended for IGeneX, where they're talking about their panel called the InCell Kine, I believe. I think it's on the main page of the IGeneX site now. So they're looking at a number of different interleukins, cytokines, CCL5, RANTES, those kinds of things. And then they're able to, using an algorithm, determine whether or not it's likely that this person is dealing with long haul COVID, whether or not it's likely that they're dealing with chronic Lyme. There is a lot of recognition now in, I think, the long COVID realm that a lot of the symptoms people have from long COVID are activation of things that maybe they didn't know before, like Bartonella, like Mycoplasma, like Epstein-Barr virus, for example. So I would look at flccc.net, and then you could maybe check out that webinar that Dr. Bruce Patterson did for IGeneX, where he talks about the testing that he's created and how it overlaps in trying to distinguish between people that are dealing with chronic Lyme, people that are dealing with long COVID.
Let's see, we have another question from Michelle. Any thoughts on HBOT?
Yeah, I think I touched on that in step 11. I have mixed feelings about it. I mean, I've seen years ago, there was a group of people in a group that I was facilitating that 4 or so of them all had chronic Lyme, and they went and spent a summer at a facility and did lots of HBOT, felt better, didn't really last. So, the challenge is the number of dives, the expense of doing it, the time commitment, and does it last? In kind of the chronic Lyme and mold realm, I'm not super excited about it, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't still have a place. I'm actually, even though many people would say it would be less effective because the home soft chambers are not going to allow you to do the same atmospheres or ATAs, I still, a few people that I have talked to over the years that had chronic Lyme that benefited from hyperbaric oxygen were those that had soft chambers at home where they could do it more consistently long term rather than, the more expensive dives over a short period of time. So, I mean, I think it has a place. It hasn't really emerged for me as a top tool.
Okay, and then Kim wanted to share a comment on a dentist that Sharon Dickerson has also been recommended.
Awesome. Yeah, it's amazing in this area. I wish I understood why there are so many amazing dentists here, but I would say the vast majority of places, it's super hard to find a good dentist. Here, it's like super hard to pick between the number of good dentists. So, I mean, that's a good problem for us to have, I think.
And does anybody have any other questions? I don't see anything coming through at this point.
Yeah, and if people have questions afterwards, I see somebody pop my email address in there. Feel free to email. I'm happy to respond to any other questions.
Well, thank you so much, Scott, for joining us. We really enjoyed your presentation today. It was very helpful.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I enjoyed being with you all as well, and I appreciate it.
And then one other comment, we just wanted to let everybody know for our next meeting, it will be, I believe, on October 15th, and it is Karen Irwin. And she does, and Jody can help me out on this, she does more cranial sacral lymph type massage, is that correct?
Yeah, she does lymphatic massage. So yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Perfect.
So she'll be talking to us about that. And then everyone, I will be posting this recording to Meetup. So since you were here, and then for those that are RSVP that may not have been able to attend, everyone will have access to this recording. And with that, his presentation. So thank you again, Scott. This was a great presentation.
All right, everybody have a great Sunday. Hopefully to see you next time.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.